So in terms of what I wanted to go through today, and I have David Weirs here who's going to be co-speaking with me, but what we promised in taking on this workshop is actually a workshop. So it's not intended to be a lecture. Our hope is that even though we're not in person, we can still keep this interactive and keep this conversational. So we welcome everyone to use the chat functionality, and if you have a comment, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. But we are hopeful that we're able to keep this as an interactive format. So, quick introductions. Again, my name is Eric Sigowski. I have about 20 years developing new medical technologies. My background spans surgical systems, diagnostic devices, drug delivery devices, and some therapeutic systems as well. My background is in mechanical engineering, and my work at Archimedic, which is a medical device development firm, is primarily in helping companies with product development planning, making sure that we lay out the right strategy, that it's inclusive of not just the technical aspects, but also the reimbursement, the regulatory, the clinical sides. We are 100% focused on new medical technologies, and so it's important for us and for our clients to be thinking holistically about how we integrate all of these different business factors into the product development plan. I'm also joined by David. David, why don't you give an introduction for yourself?
Good afternoon. David Weirs. I've had the opportunity to lead groups focusing on commercialization across healthcare for approximately 25 years. Those activities have been both global and domestic. And the scope has been interesting, and I think it'll play into the discussions that Eric and I hope to have with you today, and the fact that it does encompass efforts with payers, health systems, and the life sciences. So really across multiple stakeholders as it relates to commercialization and commercial development. By training and from my initial work, the activities are as a health economist. I've been very involved in developing the economics for healthcare, both from a product standpoint as well as a payment standpoint and payment systems. And the work that we focus on through the OCI group, the consulting organization that I'm involved with, really focuses on commercial strategy, but critically integrating value and payment into that focus on commercial strategy.
Great, thanks, David. So a quick overview, and I should just say at a high level, what this discussion is about is, preventing companies and individuals from wanting to jump straight into prototypes without really getting a firm understanding of what it is that they're trying to accomplish with the prototype. So the title of this session, Why Product Development Starts at Commercialization, is because our belief is that in order for medtech companies to be effective, it needs to be an evidence-based approach. And so what we're going to be talking about here is how to really define what evidence is needed, what the right stakeholder perspectives are, really clarifying the needs and clarifying your value proposition. So we're going to try to hit on all of these points and talk about how these different factors need to get woven into a comprehensive product development plan. We're also going to try to save some time for Q&A at the end, but as I mentioned, please jump in with questions or additional comments throughout the process. So this is going to be case study based. We're going to be talking primarily around one technology that I believe is relevant to the current COVID crisis that we are in. And the idea originates from way back in early days of the original Star Trek series. So there was an idea that was created, well, everyone's familiar with this TRICORDER concept. I'm sure most people are. The idea is that it's a handheld device that picks up a number of different vital signs from a patient and then uses an algorithm to come up with a diagnosis. So it's effectively a virtual doctor or electronic doctor. So there was an organization that put out a competition about, I think it was in 2017, and this organization is called the X Prize. They said, we want to create a modern-day tricorder. We believe that patients and doctors should have these tools at their disposal to be able to quickly diagnose individuals. So they put out a competition. They put a $3 million prize around this competition and the winner of it. And there is a local physician. He works out of Lankenau. His name is Dr. Basil Harris. He's an emergency doctor, and he's also an engineer. He said, this sounds pretty interesting, and it's kind of like what I do as an emergency doc. Patients come in, I need to triage them quickly. I need to, take some vital signs and then figure out what to do with them. Should they go for blood work? Should they go to see a specialist? And so he took this knowledge of being an emergency doctor, and he coupled that with some basic sensors and, entered this competition. He went up against 600 different companies, many of which had serious venture capital backing, and he came out the number one prize winner. So he walked away with about $3 million in order to fund this development effort. And this story, or this case study, is the one that we're going to be focusing on today. So as a first step in this process, David, I'll hand it off to you. Why don't you talk a little bit about your thoughts on the starting point here?
Yeah, what's interesting, and I think what Eric and I hope to draw out and really draw you in terms of a discussion around the case study, is what we see as some of the takeaways and some of the positive as well as potentially some of the pitfalls that arose as a function of the X Prize. First and foremost is the notion of what really drives the development. And what's interesting with regard to the X Prize is it was technology focused. It was, as Eric mentioned, to really try to see if there was an opportunity to create, in effect, a tricorder, something that was the all-in-one device. What was not necessarily considered as part of the X Prize, and I think became one of the weaknesses of those, or for those organizations that in fact participated, was what is the need in practice and how does what you're developing get deployed into a clinical setting? So this comes back to one of the points Eric mentioned that we want to stress, is really being able to understand what is your value proposition, what needs drive that value proposition, and move away from a focal point solely on the technology. The other thing that comes out of, I think, the X Prize in this case study is the implications for the design, development, and commercialization, and how it becomes, again, a holistic process where technology is certainly an element, but it is not the only element. And I think that's indicated by the initial market response, which both with regard to the basal leaf deployment, as well as there's a company that I previously was involved in that was also involved in the X Prize and was one of the finalists. The initial market response was not necessarily positive. However, I think when you take a look at the circumstances today on two dimensions, you're seeing an evolution with regard to care and care management. Obviously, what we're looking at today in terms of the movement from volume to value makes more integrated care management supportable and sustainable in the market, but certainly the pandemic and the demands on physicians and health systems to be able to extend care, to be able to extend care into remote environments, and to be able to effectively manage patients remotely, really, I think, is causing a foundational rethinking with regard to what it is to provide care and create some meaningful opportunities for these types of technologies. So those are some of the things we'd like to have as takeaways, but again, really focusing on this notion of the fact of how commercialization and development are interlinked and how the technology is a component in that cycle.
Okay, so we want to start with the need. As David was mentioning, this project had started with the technology. It started with a tricorder. Let's come up with this new technology rather than really thinking about things from the need perspective. So at Archimedic, we borrow the methodology that's used by Biodesign. So Biodesign is a program at Stanford that's very established in creating innovative medical technologies. And they basically have broken a need statement down into these three core elements. So what is the problem? Who is the patient population? And what is the specific outcome that you are looking to affect? So by combining these three things together and thinking about them very specifically, one can create a need statement that gives a company focus and ensures that everyone that is part of the organization, as well as outside stakeholders, really understand the purpose of the company. So with Basal Leaf, I'd like to throw it out to the participant members first. What would be the need statement here, or what would be the, feel free to jump in with chats. Curious to get some comments about the need. What do people see as the need that's being solved with the tricorder concept?
Hi, everyone. My name is T. Laws Williams. I was going to say the need right now is to be able to obviously access more patients virtually to prevent the spread of COVID-19 while successfully identifying these types of patients as soon as possible.
And I think that's a good point, and that's really, and what's interesting is how the market has evolved. So the fact that the need has really arisen as a function of market evolution. I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. It's not necessarily where basal leaf started, though, and I think that's the interesting point.
Right. Yeah, really good point. So, you know, if we were to first think about the, you know, one of the elements of this need statement, it's the patient or the population. Who specifically is the population? And, you know, the tricorder concept, it was initially intended for everyone. You know, it could be used for people that are at home. It could be used for people that have been discharged from the hospital. It could also be used for people that are in the hospital and attending physicians and nurses. And so this was one of the, you know, one of the initial considerations in working with the basal team is really pinpointing who specifically are we going after. And just to flesh this out a little bit more, so we've got some different personas, we think, in terms of these personalities to really help define who it is that you know that we might be targeting. So we have a hesitant Helen. She is at home. She's had this headache for a long time. It won't go away, and she's debating whether to go and see her doctor. So the idea here is that, you know, the tricorder could be used to as a replacement for her thermometer, digital thermometers. Instead, she goes and grabs the tricorder out of her medicine cabinet, and it gives her a bit more information that she's able to use to figure out if this is serious or not. The second persona is recovering Ralph. So he's got a chronic disease like CHF or COPD. He's recently been discharged from the hospital, and he's recovering at home. He might be feeling some weird things. He's experiencing some symptoms, and he's confused about, well, should I call my doctor? Should I go to the emergency department? There's some questions there for Ralph, and maybe a tricorder could help him. Maybe it could help the physicians that are monitoring him remotely better understand his condition. And then there's Critical Charlie. So Critical Charlie is in the hospital. He's also being treated for a chronic disease that has exacerbated, and it's in a very severe state. And, you know, a tricorder could be used in between nursing rounds. So it's a way of picking up his vitals ongoing in order to identify any problems that could surface. So I just saw there were a couple of chats that came in. I'm just going to see what we got. David, are you able to see those?
Yes. I mean, one of the chats is from Sam, I believe, and his point is that the point of the tricorder under its initial development was quick, efficient, and accurate diagnosis. Tia is agreeing with that, and those are the chats that I'm seeing.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you, Sam. Okay, so we have these three different user groups, and you know, we can't say right now which one of these is the right target, but for, you know, the purpose of today's session, let's just say that we have you know, homed in on recovering Ralph. He's a vulnerable patient population. He has congestive heart failure. He's been discharged from the hospital. That's the population that we're dealing with here. The problem is that you know, his exacerbations are not detected early enough. So he has a condition where if you wait too long in order to detect these exacerbations, then his health is going to rapidly decline. Additionally, there could be a situation where Ralph or his family members are misinterpreting his symptoms and overstating its problems. So maybe there's really not a significant issue with Ralph. That's a different problem that could be facing him. The outcomes.
One of the things I just want to jump in with is what you see, and there's actually been a fair amount of work done around congestive heart failure patients and the value of remote monitoring, specifically in this type of a use case. And one of the things you see is there's about a 48, sometimes contingent upon circumstance, even 72-hour window, where you effectively can, in seeing what someone is doing today on Thursday, you can actually get a pretty good understanding of what their condition is going to be in 48 hours. So in other words, this time on Saturday. And so this notion of being able to understand the problem and having this insight into the problem becomes critical as you're thinking about how to manage these individuals in a home environment.
Right. Yep. Very true. Very true. So we've got the problems defined, we've defined the population, and then the outcomes. You know, there may be some different metrics here. Here's a couple of them. 30-day mortality rate after discharge is 4%. 30-day readmission rate is 26%. There's many other outcomes, but those are two. We weave them all together into a need statement. David, why don't you run through what this looks like?
Correct. And one of the things that Eric and I want to stress with regard to the needs statement is the fact of this is meant to be iterative. So this is the point of departure with regard to the needs statement that we would like to propose, and as we go through the discussion, really be able to refine with your input. And that is a way to ensure that the exacerbations that we were talking about are detected. They're detected early, accurately, that they're understood, and they're translated really then into a means to reduce the ED visits along with readmissions and ultimately mortality for this individual.
Right. So, you know, as David mentioned, this is certainly an iterative process. But what is what is important here is to understand when we started, we began by thinking about let's create a modern day tricorder. Yeah. We've gone through this process and we've very clearly articulated what's the problem we're looking to solve, who's the patient population, and what are the outcomes. And we've come out of this with a much more focused need statement that is able to be used if you're trying to develop a product.
And I want to come back to Sam's comment about the fact of quick, efficient, and accurate diagnosis, which is absolutely true because that's what we're still speaking to here. But again, I think to Eric's point, what we've done is taken that notion of quick, efficient, and accurate diagnosis and translated it into something that is very clear from the standpoint not only of a need statement, but also from a business proposition and a use case standpoint, so that as you're thinking about the commercial pathway and thinking about the design pathway, these become elements that are much more definable and much more achievable.
Okay, so we've got a need. We've tested this need with various stakeholders, but now let's talk a little bit about who the stakeholders might be. Why don't we push that question out to all of the participants? Who are the key stakeholders here that we need to be considering? Any thoughts on who those groups or individuals might be?
I was going to say the patients, the physician, maybe the investors and the people that's involved with helping to fund and make the device. And Julie,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And so the patient, payer, doctor, investors are certainly stakeholders. Absolutely. So, what we have laid out here, you've hit a few of them, most of them, patients, clinicians, so that could be nurses, doctors, hospital administrators, regulators, and the payers. These are all stakeholders. Investors is not listed on here, but that's an important one. And they have their own unique criteria that needs to be considered in evaluating various opportunities. So, when we're looking at some questions to consider when you're thinking about your stakeholders, one of the things that we always ask right from the get-go is who pays, who is who's going to be writing a check for these to solve this problem or for these devices. How is the product distributed? How does it get from the manufacturer to the patient? Is it going through the hospital, being distributed by physicians? Is it being sent directly home to the patient? That can help you understand who a stakeholder might be. What role will the patient have in the product use? So if this is a medical implant, obviously the patient doesn't have a lot of, determination in how the product is used. They would certainly have a say in whether or not they go through the surgery, but they have a different role than a patient for basal leaf technologies. How will the product be regulated? Obviously, some products, many products that are being developed right now are at the intersection of consumer products and medical devices, and there can be a question as to, is this a regulated medical device, or is this really just a consumer wellness type of product? So understanding the regulatory aspects is important. How is use integrated into care processes and workflow? David, why don't you talk about this one a bit?
Yeah, and there's two things I want to come back to. One thing we talked about earlier, Eric, and that's this notion of who pays. Another consideration in addition to who pays is how you get paid. And this becomes a critical factor, because it really becomes an issue of the fact of, are you being paid on a fee-for-service basis, or are you being paid under a contract? Are you being paid as part of an episode or bundle, or are you being paid as part of direct care where you're in effect billing? So those determinations of how you're being paid are probably as or more important than who's paying you, because that gets into the questions of whether you're in a risk-based environment or a fee-for-service environment, and how you then have to think about what the implications are, as we'll get to in a moment from the standpoint of value. But getting back to the point that Eric raised about integration into care process and workflow, one of the questions you have with something like a tricorder, I mean, if we take this in the context of basal leaf and the tricorder, is I'm now a clinician and I have all this information coming from the patient in their home that I have to deal with. How do I deal with that? What happens to my care process? What happens to my workflow? Do I need additional staff? Do I need additional decision metrics to be able to support me in terms of how to think about this patient, which becomes very real as to whether and how I'm going to use the output of this technology and the value that I'm going to see in it from a clinical standpoint.
And then, information privacy, data security, these are all questions that can be asked to help identify who are the stakeholders that need to be considered. So let's jump into each one of these for a second. I want everybody to think about, okay, you are the patient, you are recovering Ralph here. What are some of the benefits that you all see from this technology, this idea of a modern day tricorder? Any thoughts? Not having to leave home, absolutely. That's one of the big ones. What others? No fees for emergency services, lower costs. So the individual doesn't have to pay out of pocket. In this case, that's also a really good one. We'll jump into some of these that we have here. So, Tia, you mentioned don't have to leave the house. That's critical for this. That's a really important thing for somebody that's in a vulnerable state. They don't want to have to move around, drive to the hospital. More frequent vitals checks, right? So Carl just mentioned minimum requirements on patient compliance for monitoring. So absolutely, that's a great one there. More frequent vital checks. So is it giving you and your physicians more data to be able to figure out if you are at a stable state or unstable state? Is this? Sam is mentioning this is predictive. It's looking at your future care. That's a really great point. Yeah. Sense of engagement and ownership. So it gives patients the opportunity to be part of their health care rather than being passive in this situation. What are some risks that people see in this? False readings. Thanks, Tia. Yeah, absolutely. False readings is a big one. If it's giving false, inaccurate data, it's not doing anyone any good. It can actually.
Yeah, and the other thing you get into with it's not so much false readings from the standpoint of inaccurate data. It's false readings from the fact of how do you interpret this? Because in many cases, when you're looking at vital signs and physiological parameters, these vital signs and physiological parameters have never been looked at on a continuous basis. So what's variability and what's just noise becomes, or what's trend, better way to phrase it, what's trend and what's noise or variability becomes a huge issue when you're using this type of remote monitoring and this type of a device, because in many cases you really don't know. And so the whole notion of predictive analytics and the underlying data architecture you have around this really can become critical.
Absolutely. Sam just weighed in. What if there's no Wi-Fi or limited connectivity?
Exactly.
Absolutely. If somebody is limited, having IT problems like myself today, then is that causing inconveniences? There's some problems there from the usability front. Tia mentions equipment maintenance, ensuring the latest software, calibration methods, standardization methods. are always important. So absolutely, you know, is this causing more inconvenience, more work for somebody? You know, is it possible that through these steps they're going to mess something up? Availability to immediate service. Sam, maybe elaborate on that one a little bit for me, if you don't mind, while I go through some of these. So I think we hit on some of these already. Perceived accuracy, so the sensors, are they not accurate enough? Is it giving you false data? Actual accuracy, so you know, it's not just about the sensors working, but it's also about the human factors involvement here. What if the patient, you know, puts this tricorder in the wrong location on their body? Then it could be picking up you know, inaccurate vital signs. So that's an important one. Inconvenience, you know, so I think Sam and Tia mentioned this one, charging, calibrating, connecting the product. These are all things that could cause problems for the user. And then I think there's a couple of other ones here. So Tia mentioned regulatory, always in compliance and up to date regarding device use and operations. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, it has to always be, have the latest firmware, the latest updates on it in order for it to be useful. So we're going to jump into clinical perspectives next. So imagine you are a physician or a doctor, and you're on the receiving end now, and you need to be, you know, speaking with or checking in on recovering Ralph. What are some of the benefits for the clinicians in this case?
Yeah. Notion of increasing outreach, increasing volume, better managing your volume.
So yeah, there's real-time data of remote patients. You know, you can be getting more data to make sure that your patients are safe and healthy. Faster patient turnover. You know, if you don't have as many patients coming in to the hospital, if you're able to take these remote you know, remote sessions, maybe you can get through more patients more quickly. Less patients in the emergency department. This is a big one. As David was mentioning, the emergency department visits for congestive heart failure patients are extremely high. And, you know, if that can be reduced, then it allows clinicians to be spending more time with patients that need them. Reduced readmissions, patient morbidity, potential mortality. These are all really important factors, outcomes that, you know, that could benefit things from the clinician's perspective. Run through some of the risks here. So if you're a clinician, you know, there's a lot of great things, but it could also disrupt your workflow. So you're a busy person, you have a lot going on, and now you need to also be receiving all of this data that's coming in. So there could be some significant workflow disruptions, new tasks in the care process. So now you need to maybe log into a new interface or check additional records on the EHR for patients that are not coming in as routinely. So it's creating a lot of new work. You know, is it going to be integrated into the electronic health record? That's a big question and a requirement for many new technologies, digital health technologies these days. Information recognition and cognition.
Yeah, I'll take this one. And again, this gets back to the fact of, you know, a simple way to put this is what do I do with all this data? I mean, I've got data from all these sensors that are coming in from Ralph as he's in a home environment. And how do I need to think about this from the standpoint of his overall care management and what I would normally envision as his pathway post-discharge? How do I need to now incorporate all this into what do I need to be thinking about, which is the recognition, and how do I need to be thinking about it, which is the cognitive piece?
Right. So I'm going to keep us moving. We still have a lot to go through. You know, hospital administrator benefits, you know, there's obviously risks and benefits here. You know, benefits could be reducing the 30-day, you know, readmission rate. Some risks, though, could be now you have hospitals need to inventory these devices. They need a lot of work on the IT front. There could be equipment maintenance issues. Regulator perspectives, there's a long list of perspectives here. Benefits could be reduction of morbidity, mortality. This could open up the basis for real-world evidence, which is a new pathway to collect data, clinical data, outside of controlled studies.
And increasingly for the FDA, particularly under 510K, even an option for trials. So I mean, it becomes a very meaningful consideration.
Right. Right, but there's risks. There's risks about, misdiagnosis would probably be at the top of the list. What if patients are reading something that's coming out of this and misinterpreting that and, overdosing on their medications? There could be significant risks here with this type of product as well. Payer perspectives. Dave, why don't you give a quick overview of
Yeah, I mean, effectively, from a payer standpoint, and again, this gets back into the question of not only who's paying, but how they're paying. Are you in a fee-for-service environment, or are you in some kind of a risk-based environment? Really becomes the critical issue in this. But ultimately, what you're doing is, ultimately from a payer standpoint, is you're looking to reduce costs. I mean, that's what it comes right down to. And the issue is how do you really look to try and manage that cost down, and what are going to be the levers that you can engender as a function of having the information that this technology creates. A secondary consideration really does become this notion of patient-centered care. And as a payer, if this is an objective you have, which again, I think if you're in a risk-based environment, you do, does become a consideration. How do you get care more centered around that patient? How do you get that patient more involved in their care? From the risk standpoint, what am I buying? In effect, what am I buying? And am what I'm buying going to save me money, or is it in fact going to cost me more? Not just in terms of the technology itself, but one of the critical issues when you look at how telehealth has been scored at the federal level has been generating additional use. And in fact, by having all this information on someone in their home environment, am I going to start ordering tests, diagnostics? Am I going to start doing visits to the office I otherwise would not have done, simply because I now know more about them?
Great, thanks, David. So when we're thinking about all of these benefits and risks, it really is you're weighing one set of benefits against another set of risks, and so understanding the stakeholder perspectives here is really critical, because at the end of the day, if your risks are going to outweigh your benefits, you're not going to get adoption within the healthcare system. So spending the time upfront to really clearly evaluate each of these aspects of a new medical device is critical. The fulcrum here is the value proposition. So if you have a really compelling value proposition, if you're going to be able to make a tremendous impact over the standard of care, then that fulcrum is going to move towards the risks, and the benefits are going to become much more powerful than the risks are here. So whereas if your value proposition is very weak, if you're only able to slightly affect the standard of care, then it's probably not going to give you that leverage. It's going to make it so that the risks are not going to outweigh the benefits. So just thinking about this metaphor is an important thing to consider as you're developing a new medical device. Speaking about the value proposition, let's jump into this. There's a number of ways that you can think about this. David, why don't you kind of give an overview of the value prop side?
And two things that I think Eric and I want to call out in this is one, in getting to the value proposition, when we're talking about the stakeholders, as Eric mentioned, is iterative. And that is something that we really want to stress, is the fact of the stakeholder evaluation leading to a value proposition, and then the value proposition itself is not a once and done exercise. It really does become something that has to be iterative and has to be structured in such a way that you can have ongoing learning and updates, particularly as it gets to the value prop. So in the context of the value proposition itself, what Eric and I did is lay out what could be some of the parameters that you would be looking to achieve as part of a design process leading into a clinical trial process that would then engender outcomes and evidence that you would then be able to take to the different stakeholders in terms of developing the use case in practice for the technology. And again, in the context specific to basal leaf, we're looking at reduction in mortality, readmissions, particularly ED visits, home health care, how much is required, and then the number of patients who are requiring IV medications, which is linked to home care, but can be a cost unto itself, and also have implications for clinical outcomes. Our thinking is the fact that there are others, and certainly this is something, you know, to get your thoughts on in a moment. But one of the things, and Eric, if you want to go forward with this, one of the things we also want to stress, and I think this is what you're looking at in terms of clinical design issues and what the implications are from a product design standpoint, a clinical trial standpoint, and then also a funding standpoint, is the different levels of patients you may then need in terms of being able to achieve these different outcomes and demonstrate the type of value that you're looking to do. And what are the implications that then has from a resource standpoint? So it really gets into two things that I think we want to stress. One is this notion of creating hierarchy. I mean, you have to be able to understand in terms of creating the value proposition, what is your hierarchy? And then within the context of that hierarchy, what are you going to prioritize? And that prioritization effectively becomes a consideration around design, but it also becomes a consideration around resources. Because the rule of thumb, and Eric and I were talking about this earlier this morning, and it's a rough metric, is that clinical trials, you know, depending upon the nature of the trial, can range between $10,000 and perhaps up to $30,000 a patient. So with that in consideration, you're talking about here being able to demonstrate evidence and outcomes from a clinical standpoint and also from a value and use standpoint of anywhere from $2 million to potentially up to $100 million with regard to the nature of these different trials. And what does that mean in terms of where you're going to set a hierarchy, where you're going to prioritize, and how you're then going to think about moving forward?
Yeah. So, you know, David hit on this a bit, but I think it's an important point to stress again. You know, when we're looking at some of these value proposition in medical device is really looking at what is your improvement over the standard of care. So you first really need to understand the baseline. Where are we today? You know, what are the important outcomes that need to be measured? What's the gold standard giving us? And then from that, what's the impact that we believe we can have with this new technology? That's the value proposition. There's clinical aspects of the value proposition. There's also economic aspects of the value proposition. But you gotta figure that out from the get-go. It's going to define your patient population, the study design. You know, it's going to define a lot about your product. So understanding this, you know, out of the gate is an important thing before you start, you know, really getting into the engineering details and designing the product.
You know, in a way, and again, this gets back to really the title of the workshop is commercialization as the underpinning for the design and development. This is almost where you want to start, is that if you think you have a technology that is going to influence certain parameters of care, it's almost the place you want to start is understanding what those parameters are, number one, what are the standards of care, and then what's going to make a meaningful difference. And again, this becomes part of the input from your stakeholders and being able to assess what is important from the standpoint of your stakeholders, but being able to construct this type of a grid almost then tells you from a design standpoint how you need to think about moving forward.
Right. Okay, so back to this metaphor of, you know, we have the benefits and the risks that we are weighing. You know, again, the value proposition, it's that fulcrum. It helps you either get leverage or, you know, take away leverage. Reduce your advantage. So, you know, it's an important thing to think about right from the get-go. So let's talk a little bit about milestones. You know, my feeling about medical devices is that, you know, organizations and the healthcare system, they're really what they're buying is evidence, or they're buying an effect. They're buying, you know, some type of improvement in the healthcare system. The medical device is really just a vehicle for that therapy or that diagnosis. But really, at the end of the day, what's important is the impact that the device or the technology is having on healthcare. And so, thinking about that type of impact and thinking about your medical device as just a vehicle for that impact, you know, companies should really be centering their development strategy on the evidence. What's critical is to have an end-to-end evidence generation strategy. So it's about, you know, what is the data that you can collect to show that your device is effective? You know, you might start by looking at sensor reliability. So just basic bench testing. Are the sensors reliable? Getting some initial data there. Next, you might look at human factors reliability. Are there issues with, you know, patients capturing data correctly on themselves? Are there issues with physicians and nurses, getting data, reliably on the receiving end? Right. There's the clinical validation data, so understanding, all of the data requirements that are needed for a regulatory submission. Real-world effectiveness data. So this would be, capturing the data after the product is already in the market and showing that, it's doing what we said it would. It's having the clinical impact, and it's also having the health economic impact. And then lastly, sales data. As companies are looking to grow, companies are looking to get acquired, understanding that sales data is an important milestone.
Yeah, and there's two things I'll interject real quickly. One, as Eric said, is this notion of human factors and how that really, again, depending on the nature of the device and the technology that you're developing, how that needs to play on both ends of the user spectrum. Because again, particularly in the context of basal leaf, it's very important to understand the human factors from the standpoint of the patient, but it's equally important to understand the human factors from the standpoint of the clinicians and how this information is going to be used. And then coming back to the sales data, I mean, ultimately, the validation of the value of the technology that you are looking to develop comes down to how the market responds and the extent to which you are able to drive revenue as a function of deployment into the market. So whether, again, you're looking to regardless of your strategy, whether it's to get additional funding, whether it is to partner, whether it is to sell, it is that ability to drive revenue or demonstrate the potential to drive revenue, which ultimately is going to determine the valuation for your enterprise.
Right. So if we're thinking about data as being the milestones, getting to each one of these points, there are a set of deliverables that you're going to be looking for in order to achieve this evidence, in order to collect the data that allows you to say that you've reached this particular milestone. And so when you're going through product development, when you're laying out your development plan, you need to start by understanding what are these milestones, what's the evidence that we need to gain, and then we use that to backdrive. Okay, well, what are the deliverables? What are the minimum set of deliverables that we can be providing to help an organization achieve this evidence set? Oftentimes what we see from startups is they try to jump too far into the future. They try to start to build their device for the market without really getting some of this earlier data. And there could be simpler, more cost-effective ways of achieving this data before going straight to the final product. So we like to think about what's the fastest way that we can get this data that's needed that helps companies really de-risk their venture. So, again, this is about risk reduction. So each one of these milestones is a point when the risk of a new company is going to be dropping. And as that's completed, there's this inverse relationship between the risk that's being chipped away at and the value of the company. So, as you can see, when you start out here and you're just getting into some basic bench testing, the risk is still incredibly high, which means that the value of your organization is going to be fairly low. But as you achieve these other milestones, collect the evidence that's needed, this is what results in the significant valuation inflection points. So product development considerations, a few things here as you're planning out what your next steps are. There's often a question of, well, should we hire engineers ourselves or should we be outsourcing this? For certain activities, it may make sense to have team members in-house, but you have to consider the funding gaps that are going to occur. It's rare when we're working with a startup that has a continuous flow of funding across their entire life cycle. There's usually some points where there's pausing. You have to go out and obtain more capital. And so one of the things about full-time resources is that you're paying them even through those lulls. So considering, your fixed versus variable resources, organizations that you can partner up with that, can be kind of turned on and off like a faucet, that can help you with your cash flow. MedTech expertise. At the end of the day, really what you need on your team is expertise, whether you hire it internally or whether you partner up. But groups that you are working with or individuals that you should be working with, they need to understand medical. It's not enough just to be a good engineer. In MedTech, the regulatory, clinical, reimbursement sides are often they carry far more risk than the technical side. And the team, the product development team, really needs to know how to pull those elements together into the development plan. That's critical. Credentials matter. So, 1345 is one of the primary certifications that's needed for developing medical devices. It's not just about building a prototype, but it's also about creating the design history file, the device master record, all of the protocols that are needed for future regulatory submission. So making sure that you have a team that's able to not only develop a strong technical product, but also have a quality approach and all of the documentation that's needed for your future regulatory submission. That's really critical. And then lastly, supply chain. You're going to need to be pulling on suppliers. Maybe those are injection molders or sheet metal houses or contract manufacturers. But whether you build those suppliers organically or whether you work with a firm that already has that approved supplier list in place, it can really sort of catapult you forward and accelerate your process if you find people that already have those.
And one thing I'll add, and this again I think is in the context, and it's obviously the circumstance we're dealing with today with COVID-19 is extreme. But it really, I think, to Eric's point, it highlights, and this is, I think, going to be one of the learnings in general for healthcare and for all industries that comes out of the current experience, is, how does your supply chain look and how robust is it? And as you're moving from prototype into production, what kind of redundancy do you need to have in your supply chain, and what kind of redundancy do you have in your supply chain? And again, having outside expertise in that, I think, is going to become increasingly critical. Great.
Yeah, thanks, David. So we wanted to leave a few minutes at the end here. I think we only had an hour blocked out, but it's 12:55. Any questions or comments? Feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat window, whatever you'd prefer.
Yeah, just want to say, this is Shri. Just want to say thank you so much, Eric, for walking through all the steps that a startup should consider. And again, just to give a quick overview, Eric, Archimedic is one of the service providers in the list of our PRIMA partners. And then the way, I'm sorry, probably I will wait until let's get the questions for this, and I can give a little bit overview of how PRIMA works.
If there are no questions, I can flip through very quickly and just talk about some of our work at Archimedic. I'll just focus on some of the things that we focus on as an organization and how we might be able to help. But as questions come up, feel free to just pop them into the chat window. But we are a medical device engineering firm. However, what we've talked about today is mostly at the front end of planning. Our firm belief is that determining the right product to build is far more important than how you build the product. You have to be focusing on the right needs. You have to be focusing on the right problems to solve. Execution is certainly important, but where we see many startup companies kind of steer off the wrong way or not spend the right amount of time and focus is it on that front end of really defining the problem. So that's why we've spent a fair amount of time there. But at our core, we are an engineering firm. We work in therapeutic systems, so photonics-based dermatological systems. We've worked in a number of life-sustaining tissue preservation systems, CPAP devices. We have a lot of experience in drug delivery, doing auto-injectors, safety syringes, reconstitution devices, electronic dosing systems. We've done a fair amount in diagnostics and imaging devices. This image that is shown here is a foot ulcer detection mat for a startup that came out of MIT called Podometrics. And this is a device that takes a thermal scan of the bottom of an individual's feet and looks for ulcers that may be the onset of or looks for hot spots that might be the onset of a diabetic foot ulcer. And it ultimately would prevent amputations from occurring. We've done a lot in surgical instrumentation. This device here is a laparoscopic device that we've developed for a local company called ZSX Medical. We have a lot of orthopedics experience as well. We work with a number of established companies, the J&Js of the world, startup companies that are looking to move quickly, and then many organizations that we consider pre-companies, so academic medicine, where there's a lot of very interesting medical innovations, and they need a team to help advance these research platforms. So with that said, I don't see any questions coming in. I will go back to this final slide here. So if you are looking for more information, you are welcome to reach out to me. My email is here, my phone number is here, or David as well. David operates as a clinical or a commercialization consultant for us, so we would be happy to speak with you.
And I think then, Sri, if you would like to provide some information with regard to the PRIMA program.
Yeah, and again, please reach out to Kate or me, like if you need any info or PRIMA, like we are planning to organize these workshops with each of our partner service providers to give a quick overview of the service provider, and also like to see if any of the programs or products you are developing is a fit with these service provider.